welcome the students who have come into the high-speed rail 102. My name is Stan Feinsod, and I'm speaking to you from Atlanta, Georgia, from a hotel room where I am preparing for an interview tomorrow morning. So I apologize if the connection is any different than it should be. As you know, HSR 102 is part of a demonstration program, a project of the Federal Railroad Administration, Michigan Technological University, and the Mineta Transportation Institute of San Jose State University in San Jose, California. We have a series of 3 lectures that supplement HSR 101 that I hope that all of you worked on and took part of. The 101 content is a great introduction to the subject of high-speed rail. And what I want to talk to you today about is generally the status of American policies and programs to deal with high-speed rail in the United States. So just to start, we go back to the 70s, the late 60s, when passenger railroading in the U.S. was provided by the freight railroads. It was a statutory responsibility that they had in return for having the rights to the rights-of-way that they secured many years before, and they were flailing. They were having great financial problems. Passenger railroad services were losing a lot of money, and out of the crisis came a solution called the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, a creation of the U.S. Congress that is called Amtrak. Amtrak was created in a way to maintain passenger rail services in the United States by conveying the responsibility for passenger services from the freight railroads to this new national corporation. The freight railroads were relieved of the responsibility of providing passenger service. In return, the freight railroads were required to let the new organization, Amtrak, have access to their rights-of-way with new passenger trains that would be operated by Amtrak, and paying for that right only the cost incremental to the freight railroad for carrying passenger trains. So it was an incremental cost formula carrying with it statutory access to the rights-of-way. The statute created a base passenger rail network for intercity trains across the United States, and it was that basic network which was not the same as all of the passenger trains that had been operating before the statute, but was a subset of that. And then the Amtrak service came in. I don't have the exact date. It was in 1972. And intercity passenger rail service in the United States was reborn under the National Railroad Passenger Corporation. With respect to federal investment in this network, certainly Amtrak received the benefit of rolling stock investments, and it was heavily subsidized from the beginning to maintain what was considered an essential passenger rail network. Significant infrastructure investments only were made on the Northeast Corridor, and there was a large Northeast Corridor project to rehabilitate from Washington to New York in the 70s and the early 80s. And subsequent to that, again, only minor capital investments were made. Amtrak owned most of the right-of-way between Washington and New York, and a little bit of the right-of-way north of New York into Boston, most of which was owned by the state of Massachusetts, and the Amtrak portion was limited The New Haven Railroad right-of-way was also used by Amtrak, and that was owned by the Metropolitan Transportation Authority in New York. There was a second major investment in the Northeast Corridor where the non-electrified territory from New York to Boston was electrified. This project was a project of the late 90s, and it resulted in a fully electrified Northeast Corridor. But to underscore the point, these were the only significant infrastructure investments in the entire country for passenger railroading, for intercity passenger rail. The rest of the United States had better rolling stock, but not really improved rolling stock. And as we look at the situation even today, we can conclude that in the United States, intercity passenger rail with Amtrak was kind of left to its own devices. Small investments, some rolling stock investments, major investments in the Northeast Corridor, but nothing substantial. And looking at the rest of the world, particularly in Europe, you see a constant series of investments and innovations and changes to intercity passenger rail, which morphed slowly into the nascent trans-European high-speed rail system that we see today. But here in the United States, since the 70s, the intercity passenger rail network really didn't amount to very much in terms of innovation or change or planning or improvement. The first federal legislation to consider, other than the Amtrak authorization, to consider intercity passenger rail was the 2008 Passenger Rail Improvement Act. And I think it's really important to reflect from the early 70s to 2008, a long period of time, a long period to have a kind of stagnant situation for intercity passenger rail. In 2008, the Passenger Rail Investment Act, for the first time, created a small funding program, generally speaking, for intercity passenger rail other than the Northeast Corridor. It was an authorization act for Amtrak, and there had been quite a number of them since the 70s, but this was the first one that went further, that created a intercity passenger rail program that spoke to the improvement of services and operations for intercity trains in the United States, that talked about state-sponsored corridors. And now I need to go back a bit and say that starting in the 80s, some of the states, under a program that had been called the 503B program, states were able to finance improvements to the intercity rail networks in their states in association and in cooperation with Amtrak. So you had states like North Carolina creating a more robust intercity passenger rail service. You had the Cascades in between Washington and Oregon. Again, services that were sponsored by the states of Washington and Oregon. And in California particularly, a very significant investment in service on the three corridors in California, the Capital Corridor, the San Diegan Corridor, which is now the Pacific Surfliner Corridor, and the San Joaquin Corridor. These three corridors in California were the beneficiaries of very significant amounts of state of California funding, and including new rolling stock and infrastructure improvements. The California program was the most robust in the country with respect to a state buying into intercity passenger rail and making significant improvements. Although there are today somewhere around 15 states who have state-sponsored improved intercity passenger rail systems and have invested their own money in addition to some small amounts of Amtrak monies. And just to give you an example of how that works, in the Capital Corridor, there was no service at all between Sacramento and San Jose. It was a complete invention of the state of California. So the state of California basically contributed all of the money necessary to operate and to capitalize that service. In the corridor in the south between San Diego and Los Angeles, the base network of Amtrak had 4 trains. And as the state added trains, the percentage of the responsibility changed from 100% Amtrak to more and more state responsibility. So there was a shared environment for the Pacific Surfliner service. So in 2008, PREA, I'm coming back to where I started on PREA. It talked about improving service, improving operations, and improving facilities. It divided the world of intercity passenger rail into long-distance trains, Northeast Corridor trains, state-sponsored trains, and trains on what were called recognized high-speed rail corridors, where the Congress had and the administration had recognized 10 specific corridors as high-speed rail corridors. The statute gave responsibilities to the states and in making sure that the states had a say in the improvement of their services, and it created a series of small investments in passenger railroad service for generally improving intercity passenger rail corridors, for developing along the lines of a high-speed rail network using the corridors that were designated, the 10 designated corridors. That it talked about in that regard speeds of at least 110 miles an hour, and I'll talk a little bit more about speeds in a second. And the third category was congestion relief, in the belief that passenger rail services on intercity corridors, for the most part, were on freight railroad-owned property. And there were some places, a good number of places, where the congestion between freight trains and passenger trains was a difficult problem to overcome and had a significant impact on on-time performance and performance generally. So with these 3 categories, PREA reinvented a federal concern for intercity passenger rail. And I should underscore the fact that PREA was the first statutory language to address financial needs of intercity passenger rail in the United States. And the context, of course, is a large and robust surface transportation program sponsored by the federal government and including the highway systems, urban public transportation systems, and other public transportation systems. So the surface transportation program is a large and continuing investment of the federal government, and of course it started with the Interstate Highway Program in the 50s and continues this day. But in that program, in that federal transportation authorization, other than PREA, there is no intercity passenger rail investment program. And PREA opened that door for the first time. Another aspect of PREA is that it recognized, again for the first time, that there may well be other operators than Amtrak who could compete for the right to operate and maintain intercity passenger rail services. So there was a creation of a competitive program that was defined in PREA, but has not yet been implemented. And the statutory language was very awkward, and it turned out impossible to implement. Although the Federal Railroad Administration attempted to, but there were simply no takers under the language that was in the statute. Now, we move to, when we talk about 2008, we can remember the events of 2008, which has now been labeled as the Great Recession. We had a somewhat of an economic collapse in the United States, and we had an election, a new president and vice president sworn into office in early 2009, and then the development of responses to the economic situation. Among them was another statute, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, fondly known as ARRA, and we realized at that time that a huge number of dollars needed to be invested in America to get the economy back on track and to solve a myriad number of problems.